Hi, this is Dr. Karen Becker, and today I have a very special guest. My guest, Dr. Ronald Schultz, who is here with us. Actually, I'm at his facility at the University of Wisconsin-Madison School of Veterinary Medicine. Dr. Schultz heads up the Pathobiological Sciences Department. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for coming.
It's a cold day here in Wisconsin. Dr. Schultz, prior to the interview, was telling me a little bit about how when he arrived here 29 years ago?
29 years ago.
29 years ago, he was the sole, I call him an immunologist, and veterinary immunology is really where his specialty is in terms of focus for education and research. But he came here as the first pathobiological sciences person.
Correct.
And you now, tell me a little bit about your department.
Well, we now have about 150 faculty, staff, and students in the department. It's the largest of the 4 departments here in the school. And we have responsibility for a variety of subjects, including bacteriology, immunology, virology, parasitology, public health, epidemiology, and clinical and anatomic pathology. So it is a big group,
yes,
and an important group within any veterinary school.
Yes, it is. Part of the reason that I was so excited about having Dr. Schultz join us today is that if you begin thinking about vaccine decisions for your pets, you will absolutely come across not only Dr. Schultz information, but he's involved in about every aspect of the vaccine topic, from working with vaccine manufacturers, putting together protocols, testing protocols. He's the man that's actually in the lab doing the research, which is, it's an honor to have you here with us. So in light of all of that information, many of you on the Healthy Pets website have questioned me about what to do about vaccines. It's probably one of the most hotly debated topics in veterinary medicine, and part of the reason it's so hotly debated is we of course want to be able to provide protection to our pets, but there's a big difference between providing protection in terms of giving them immunologic protection against life-threatening diseases and over-vaccination. And there's probably no one in the world more well-versed in this discussion than you. So my first question is this. I'm going to have you talk a little bit about the fact that when people first acquire a pet, many people they're not able to correlate that we as people, we don't go in every year for measles, mumps, rubella, DPT.
Correct.
We're vaccinated as kids, and then we have protection for life. When owners acquire their first dog or kitten and we bring them to the veterinarian, many veterinarians will say, we want to give your puppy or kitten a series of puppy shots, which are not necessarily any different than adult shots. And we want to give them maybe every 2 to 4 weeks. When I was working at the Humane Society, our protocol was giving a puppy a 5-way combination vaccine at 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16 weeks, and then an annual booster forever until they die. And at that time, now this was 20 years ago, at that time, that was considered a good idea to help provide optimal protection. And when I went to vet school and I learned that vaccines never wear off, I was a little confused about some of those recommendations coming from veterinarians. Can you expound a little bit, not only on the how dogs and cats develop immunity, but where you've seen the vaccine issue in your career, how you've seen things change?
Well, some of those questions were the questions that I asked back in the 70s. How often do we need to vaccinate dogs and cats? And what vaccines are actually required? And in those days, there were not a lot of vaccines, and so every time we got a new vaccine, we added it to the syringe. But by the 80s, we had 12, 14 different vaccines that were part of combination products. And from an immunologic standpoint, I knew that was not good. Also, from the standpoint of animals developing adverse reactions, the animals knew that that wasn't good. So back in the 70s, and this was something that was really not thought about very much, is a colleague of mine, Dr. Fred Scott, and I actually in 1978 came out with a vaccination protocol where we were suggesting that after the puppy shots or the kitten shots, the animal be vaccinated again at a year, but then every 3 years or less frequently. So this was in 1978 that we actually published that information. Well, of course, it takes a long time for change to occur.
30 years. years.
And yeah, it was actually in 1998 that the American Association of Feline Practitioners came out with guidelines that were very much like what we had published 20 years earlier. Now, what we have come to find out over those years, and of course we have a lot more vaccines today than we did then, but we know that there are certain vaccines that every dog or every cat should receive. And we have called those the core vaccines. And for the dog, it happens to be canine distemper, canine parvovirus, and canine adenovirus. And for the cat, it's feline panleukopenia, which is often referred to as distemper, but it's the feline parvovirus, which was the ancestral virus for canine parvo, and then feline caleci and feline herpes virus. And for both species, we have as core rabies vaccines. So those core vaccines are vaccines that every cat or every kitten and every puppy should receive, because the diseases can be very severe, and mortality from those particular infections can be as high as 60, 70, 80% in young animals. So that's why we consider those core. Now, the remaining vaccines, which there are many of for both the dog and cat, we refer to as non-core or optional. And so that's where we are right now with regard to the vaccines and which ones every animal should receive versus which ones only certain animals should receive, core versus non-core.
What are your thoughts in terms of indoor house cats, where exposure, in theory, if you have an educated owner that is not going to be introducing outdoor feral kitties into that confined environment, what are your thoughts on indoor house cat vaccines in terms of recurrent vaccination requirements?
Well, I think that, as I suggested, the core vaccines, the panleukopenia, if you want to look at it in a minimalistic way, every cat must get panleukopenia as a kitten. And the last dose of those kitten shots should be at 14 to 16 weeks. And the reason for that is, depending on the antibody that the mom has, that antibody is actually passed on to the kitten or to the puppy, and it becomes systemic. It will have a certain finite life, though, because it is passive, and about every 2 weeks it will decay, but depending on how high it is in the queen or in the bitch, that will determine which one of those puppy or kitten vaccinations actually immunize.
And you might want to mention, there's a difference between being vaccinated and being immunized.
Absolutely.
Yes.
We do a lot of vaccinating and sometimes don't do very much immunizing, especially in the puppy and the kitten, because that maternally derived antibody can actually block the vaccine from working. So it's one of the reasons we give multiple vaccines. In the old days, back in the 60s and 70s when vaccines first came out, what we actually used to do for puppies at that time is we would establish a nomograph. And not very many people know about the nomograph anymore, but what it was based on the antibody titer of the mother. And we could then determine, based on half-life, exactly when the puppy or kitten needed to be immunized.
And now it's funny that you say that you determined this long ago. People that come to my practice, Natural Pet, I have a lot of proactive, really excellent wellness breeders, and many of them, or new people coming in interested in potentially breeding their pet responsibly and ethically and proactively, will say, do you know, have you heard about Dr. Schultz's new titering protocol? And it's actually very old.
Yes, very old.
It's fabulous. And so really what he's done, which has been excellent at avoiding unnecessary puppy vaccines, but making sure you're vaccinating when the body's able to receive vaccine and produce antibody, is he can check the bitch's blood and determine the exact day that maternal antibody is going to wax and wane away from the puppy system. The whole principle of vaccines really is after puppies and kittens nurse from their mama, they get a set of antibodies, and those maternal antibodies will last them. We can't look at a puppy or kitten and see, but we know it lasts them anywhere between, let's say, 5.5 and 9 weeks-ish.
Right.
And the whole principle of vaccine is they nurse from mom, they get this gifted immune system, and then as those maternal antibodies wear off, there's this period of time before their own pet's immune system picks up, and there's this window of opportunity where if they're exposed to viruses, it will kill them. So the whole principle behind vaccine is we want to provide to them a stimulus to be able to make an antibody, so if this infectious disease is encountered, they're able to effectively mount an immune response and not die from it. But here's what's great. You can actually titer the bitch. You know the exact day that maternal antibody is going to wear off in that puppy.
Right.
And so you're not giving any unnecessary vaccine. You're providing the correct vaccine at the appropriate
Right.
time when the puppy's immune system can mount an immune reaction, which is fabulous. So I think it's funny. That's actually, now in my generation of veterinarians, it's very hip and trendy to do this.
Correct.
And yet you were doing it for old school.
Yeah, they were doing it even before I got involved in
Yes.
immunology.
Yeah.
One of the reasons that they stopped doing it was that it took a fair amount of time to get the results back. You had to bleed the animal, send the sample off. The other thing that really was found is that it varied for each of the different vaccines. So you might be able to find that the puppies could respond to distemper at 8 weeks, but then when you looked at parvo, they couldn't respond to parvo to 12 or 14 weeks. So then it was decided that a series of vaccinations would probably be the way to go. It's less expensive. So expense came in, and today titers are extremely expensive, and it was faster because you didn't have to wait for those results. And so what we suggest today is not starting your vaccination program before 6 to 8 weeks of age in either the puppy or the kitten, and then do not revaccinate more often than every 2 weeks. So it would be between 2 and 4 weeks. So if you started your program at 8 weeks, you would give another dose of vaccine of the core vaccines at 12 weeks, and then a third dose at 16 weeks.
And
so that would be your vaccination program.
protocol.
And
And what I do at Naturopet, we get a vaccine in at before 12 weeks of age, so 9 to 10 weeks, and then we boost again between 15 and 16 weeks of age, and then we titer 2 weeks after that last vaccine. To see if there's been a response.
Yes.
And you might want to be able to explain that although rare, there can be what's called a non-responder. Maybe you can explain what that means.
yes, so what we want to do is we want to make sure that that vaccination program has actually induced an immune response. And the best way to look for that immune response is to do an antibody titer for distemper in the dog, and parvo in the dog, or panleukopenia, which of course is the feline parvo virus. They would be the 3 things that I recommend doing titers for. And you need to wait at least 2 or more weeks after the last dose, which in the series should be somewhere between 14 and 16 weeks. At that time, the maternally derived antibody has dropped off, so we don't have to worry about having antibody left from mom in the puppy. If there's antibody there, we know that the animal, puppy or kitten, has responded. They not only have been vaccinated, they've actually been immunized.
Right, and that's the key. You can put a wad of vaccines into animals, and if the animal didn't have a functional immunologic response, it's all for none. They get all the toxicity and none of the benefit. So the whole reason that we vaccinate is to help provide some protective immunity against these life-threatening diseases that dogs and cats are exposed to.
Now, one of the questions you did ask is about the non-responder.
Yes.
And unfortunately, there are genetic non-responders, which means that they won't respond regardless of whether you gave the vaccine at an appropriate time or not. And I estimate these non-responders in terms of puppies and their ability to respond to canine parvovirus at about 1 in 1,000 puppies in the general population. But because it is genetic, certain breeds, and more importantly, certain families of dogs will have, of course, much higher than 1 in 1,000. It might be 1 in 100 or 1 in 10. Similarly, for distemper, the animal can be a non-responder. Now, the animals that are non-responders to parvo respond beautifully to distemper. And the ones that are non-responders for distemper respond beautifully to parvo. So it is very strictly defined to that specific vaccine or that specific disease. Now, unlike the parvo, where we have about 1 in 1,000 in the population, we have fewer for distemper, about 1 in 5,000. So,
rare.
yes, probably because distemper has been in the canine species for hundreds, if not thousands of years, whereas parvo just came into the canine species in 1978.
Right, it's new.
Yeah.
So after we've established protective immunity, which means we know we've given, I call it a modified vaccine protocol, because we're specifically choosing times when we know that puppies and kittens will be able to immunologically respond. We've done our due diligence and titered to make sure that there's been a protective immune system response to the vaccines. Those pets are protected for life. So when veterinarians, if you follow the protocol, and we know that they've been titered 2 to 4 weeks after last vaccine occurring at 14 to 16 weeks, and we know that they've responded, there's not a reason for you to continue boosting, because giving more vaccine doesn't make your pet more protected. It doesn't give them a better immune response. And that's one of the fallacies that many of my clients don't understand when they first begin asking questions about vaccines. They assume that when they get that postcard in the mail that said it's time for Fido's boosters, sometimes those postcards say things like, your pet could be unprotected. Hurry, you're 4 days overdue for those vaccines. It's a little frustrating to me as a proactive veterinarian, because really what we're working off of is fear.
Yes, and one of the things that is really important to understand is that just like when we look at vaccines for children, one of the core vaccines is MMR. I refer to distemper, parvo, and adeno as the MMR of puppies. And those 3 vaccines, all core vaccines that every puppy should receive, those vaccines have the potential to provide lifelong immunity. And so we're not sure that all puppies will have lifelong immunity, and that's one of the reasons that we will vaccinate a few times through the life of that puppy. Now, it depends on whether you want to take a minimalistic approach to vaccination, which, by the way, I've been doing for many, many years with my pets, my children's pets, my grandchildren's pets, where they will be vaccinated as puppies. I make sure that they respond, or as kittens, to panleukopenia, and they don't get vaccinated again. But a lot of people are not comfortable with that kind of program. And so what we've done is we've come up with guidelines where we suggest that if you don't do that antibody titer 2 or more weeks after the last puppy shot, then we're recommending that you revaccinate in a year. And that's what the American Animal Hospital Association recommends, and that's what the American Association of Feline Practitioners recommends. And then after that, what we recommend is 3 years or longer, which means not more often than 3 years. And now that's a very conservative number, in that most of those animals will be protected for life.
Right.
So giving the vaccine every 3 years may not be necessary.
Right.
So some clients, and some, of course, dog owners in particular, not so much the cat owner, they will go with titers to actually determine whether or not
Right.
they need a so-called booster
Right.
vaccination or revaccination. So the titer
Yes.
can be used again
Yes.
at a later time, and you can decide, do I want to do a titer at 3 years and see whether or not the animal actually has immunity and needs to be vaccinated? Or do I want to just vaccinate? And that option is available to you.
Of course, and most of our viewers are not interested in providing vaccines unless, of course, it's immunologically needed. So that's
Right.
when the titer becomes a really great choice. Now, let's talk a little bit about titering, because there's several different methods of titering.
Yes, yes.
And if you get an older animal whose immune system hasn't seen, let's say, distemper virus, if you're measuring the number of antibodies, like serum virus neutralization, you could, in theory, have a low titer, and yet the body still have an anamnestic response or memory cells. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So one of the things that we do, and I try not to talk about antibody titer, because titer, by definition, does mean the level, some number, 2, 4, 8, 16, and frequently it is a doubling dilution kind of test. If you use the gold standard, you brought out the virus neutralization, and that's what's really the gold standard for antibody to distemper and adeno, whereas neutralization or a test called hemagglutination inhibition is the standard for parvo. And all of these tests are really only done by a few labs, and most of those labs are associated with veterinary schools. So that's important to understand too. The gold standards are done in diagnostic labs associated with veterinary schools, whereas the commercial tests that are available, they use different methodologies. They use something known as ELISA technology to look for antibody. They may use something called a fluorescent antibody, etc. But those tests will be correlated with the gold standards so that we know what they mean. So some of your diagnostic labs then, when they report back results, they'll have a number that they give. And some of them believe that those numbers mean something. I don't happen to believe those numbers mean anything.
I think you should say that again.
I
Going
don't
to say
believe
that
those
again.
numbers mean anything
Yes.
as long as they're positive.
As long as you have a response.
That's correct. So if you have on, for example, the virus neutralization test for distemper, a 4 or an 8 or a 16 or a 32 or a 64, that means that animal's immune system has developed antibody, it is primed, and if in fact the animal sees distemper, if the distemper isn't immediately neutralized, there will be what's known as a anamnestic or secondary memory response, and the animal will be protected.
Much like
And so-
the influenza virus for you and I that we were exposed to maybe 20 years ago.
Correct.
Yes, that our body still has memory to be able to produce adequate immunologic response despite the fact we haven't seen that flu virus
Correct.
maybe in 5, 6, 7, 10, 20 years.
Correct.
Yes.
And so it's an excellent example. When, for the first time, this H1N1 pandemic flu was spreading around the country last year, there were virtually no people that had immunologic memory to that specific flu type, the pandemic H1N1. About the only people that would have seen a similar virus were the ones that were around in the 1918 pandemic, and there weren't a lot of those around.
No.
And that's why, especially for younger children, if they were getting that flu shot, they were recommending that they get 2 of them because they had no immunologic memory whatsoever. So
There was a
with
boost.
an influenza vaccine, which is called a non-infectious or inactivated vaccine, the only way those vaccines work is when you give 2 doses. So unlike the core vaccines that are all modified live or infectious vaccines where 1 dose will immunize as long as there's not something like maternally derived antibody to prevent that immunization, you only need 1 dose. Whereas with the non-infectious, killed, inactivated type vaccines, you must have 2 doses, and they should be 2 or more weeks apart. Yeah, you shouldn't go any more frequently than every 2 weeks.
So let's talk a little bit about the killed virus that is mandatory in every state, rabies virus.
Rabies.
And let's talk about why some states there have a 1-year option and a 3-year option.
Right.
Some of my clients erroneously think that the 3-year vaccine is 3 times stronger.
Mm-hmm.
Some people think it's 3 times as much volume. Some
Right.
people think that it's been researched 3 times longer. If you could shed a little bit of light on what's really going on, that would be excellent.
Okay, now rabies is a really good example of a non-infectious vaccine. Now, prior to the mid-'80s, all of our canine and feline rabies vaccines were modified live. So 1 dose was adequate to immunize, and you generally gave that dose at 12 weeks of age or older when there was no maternally derived antibody to interfere. In those days, with the modified live, you then would revaccinate each year because they didn't know whether or not the immunity was longer than that. Well, in the late 70s and early 80s, we had an episode occur in this country where some kittens being vaccinated in California came down with rabies. And that caused USDA to rethink the approval of a modified live rabies vaccine. Now, this may have actually been not the vaccine becoming virulent, but those kittens could very well have been severely immune suppressed. They could have actually been infected with feline leukemia virus and or feline immune deficiency virus. And that's why they came down with rabies. But obviously, when that happened, it was decided that modified live or infectious rabies would no longer be allowed, and we then started switching entirely over to a non-infectious, killed, inactivated rabies product. We never did change the vaccination program. We changed the vaccine, but not the program. And my recommendations, actually back in 1976, which I published then, and in 77 and 78, when we switched from a modified live rabies vaccine to an inactivated vaccine, we should give 2 doses, 2 to 4 weeks apart, and then revaccinate in a year. But we didn't. Fortunately, the rabies glycoprotein antigen in the killed vaccine is a very powerful antigen, and they had to add something to that vaccine, which you generally have to add to most inactivated vaccines, called an adjuvant. And an adjuvant is a very strong immunostimulant which provided enough stimulation to that glycoprotein to allow that 1 dose of vaccine to stimulate in a majority, not in all, but in a majority of dogs and kittens, a protective response until another dose could be given a year later. Now, generally, when you go much beyond about 6 to 8 weeks between the 2 doses, you'll have no immunity at all. For example, any of you who might use a lepto product, you would never go beyond 6 weeks between the 2 doses because you wouldn't have any immunity at all. That's a very weak antigen compared to rabies.
So back to antigens. what is added? Could you go over the antigenics, the antigens that are added to veterinary vaccines? Some of the antigens that have been included in human vaccines, like thimerosal, have been, they have removed them from the vaccines, but that hasn't been the case in veterinary medicine.
Okay, so there's a number of different things added to various vaccines. One is a preservative, and the thimerosal, which contains mercury, is a very effective preservative, and that has been added to human vaccines for many, many years.
Yep.
It's one of the most effective preservatives. We haven't had thimerosal added to very many veterinary vaccines at any point. We do have other preservatives, but that was one that really wasn't used widely like it was in human medicine. Now, the thimerosal has become very much of a concern because mercury, being one of a number of heavy metals, does have the potential to cause adverse reactions. And it can be very toxic at high levels and neurotoxic in the case of mercury at high levels. So it's one of the things that they have made an effort in human medicine to get it out of all vaccines or to reduce it significantly. And right now, most human vaccines no longer contain that particular preservative, contain another preservative. In veterinary vaccines, I'm not aware of any of them containing thimerosal because we didn't have that many in the first place.
And aluminum?
And aluminum was part of, and it's still the most common part of human adjuvants, because alum is the adjuvant that's added, and it's the only one approved for human vaccines. Again, we have veterinary vaccines that have alum or aluminum in, but we have many other adjuvants in veterinary medicine. Veterinary medicine actually has always been far ahead of the vaccine curve than human medicine. We have vaccines using new technology that have been improved in veterinary medicine, and it's still not approved in human medicine.
There's a lot more research.
There's a great deal more research that we can apply to veterinary vaccines. It's not that they're not doing that research for human vaccines, it's just that they're very slow to apply it. They can't get approval for a lot of new technologies and new adjuvants and so forth as quickly as we can in veterinary medicine. The other advantage we have in veterinary medicine, which is very critical, and I hope as pet owners you understand how important this is to your pet, and that is the ability for us to do animal studies on a target species. So if I want to develop a new vaccine or drug for dogs, I want to do that work in dogs. I don't want to do it in rodents, which is what you have to do for human vaccines until you can actually take it to a clinical trial. But it takes a long time to get there. It's one of the reasons that we can move more quickly in veterinary medicine, and I think we can also make a better product because we can test it on 10 beagles. So we don't have to test it on someone's poodle.
So then back to the adjuvant question. We see vaccine reactions in veterinary medicine. We see pets die from vaccines in veterinary medicine. We see long-term, you know, there are 4 different types of allergic reactions. We can see anaphylaxis. We can see a secondary
autoimmune disease,
and then long-term progressive degenerative autoimmune diseases. Does it feel to you, first of all, are you able to correlate, like many practicing veterinarians are, the correlation between over-vaccination and autoimmune and an increase in autoimmune conditions in pets?
Well, I think there's no question in both pets and humans, autoimmunity is more prevalent today than it was 20 years ago, than it was 40 years ago. And I think there are multiple reasons for that. without question, vaccines would be one of those reasons. But also there are many intoxicants, there are many environmental pollutants, there are many chemicals.
Metals.
And yes, and so there are a lot of factors in the environment that in what generally is a genetically predisposed individual, and that's the important thing, for example, about immune-mediated or hypersensitivity type diseases. Genetics plays such a key role. These other factors are triggers to cause in a genetically predisposed individual these immune-mediated diseases. And it can be natural infection, it can be vaccines, and it can be all those other factors. And so, yes, we are seeing more of it,
Absolutely.
and in all of the species.
Yep. So if you have pets that have either had vaccine reaction, what's your recommendation? I mean, in my practice, if you have an animal that has had vaccine reaction, first of all, we have a very minimalistic vaccine protocol. We do titer to make sure that it's
Right.
been effective. But if we've had animals that have had vaccine reaction, it would be out of the question for me to continue to vaccinate the pet. I simply wouldn't do it.
That's absolutely the approach that everyone should take.
Yes.
Now, if it's an adverse reaction to a core vaccine and you've already immunized, what you should be doing is a titer. And if there is any titer measurable, don't
Right.
give that particular
Right.
product again. If there isn't, you're going to almost be obligated to make sure the animal is protected against those core diseases because they are so deadly and it's so important to have immunity. And you have a few options. You can pre-treat the animal depending on what the reaction is, but that will be no assurance that they won't have
Right.
another adverse reaction.
Right.
You can switch products to another product and hope that it was something within that product, that specific product you used initially. But that also won't guarantee you won't have a reaction because the animal may, for example, be hypersensitive to bovine serum albumin, which would very likely
Right.
be in any
Sure.
manufacturer's product.
And really, being that the risk versus benefits, the risk would be high enough. Certainly, that would be something that I wouldn't feel comfortable doing in terms of revaccinating a patient that has had a reaction because the potential's there for a more significant reaction to occur.
Correct,
Certainly.
yes.
Now, back to the 1 year, 3 year rabies.
Let me get
Okay,
back to that
yes.
particular question. We want to make sure the animal is immune to the core products. Now, if that adverse reaction was to a non-core product, an optional product, which they very often are,
Of course.
quite honestly, the core vaccines are far safer than the non-core in terms of adverse reaction.
Yes, we'll talk about why in a minute.
My
Yes.
response is always forget about
Yep.
that particular vaccine. If it happened to be lepto or if it happened to be Lyme
Right.
or if it was injectable Bordetella, don't even think about giving it again.
Right, right. And that to me would be a common sense approach. That if you've had a patient have a significant reaction to a vaccine that your veterinarian is encouraging you to get, let's say for protection against lepto, that would be something we would just tell you to not, or Lyme vaccine.
Right.
Simply don't continue giving those injections. It would seem counterintuitive to do so. Rabies, there's a 1 year product in some states and a 3 year product.
Right.
Talk a little bit about why there's not a 12 year rabies or a 20 year rabies or a 7 year
Well,
rabies.
thanks for asking that question because, as you know, we're doing some
Yes, you
studies
are.
right now
Yes, you are.
to try and demonstrate a minimum duration of immunity for rabies at 7 years, so we can extend that period. So right now, the reason that we don't have one of those products is no one has really done the studies
Research, yeah.
to demonstrate that you can go beyond 3 years.
And those studies are really
And
expensive.
They are very,
They
very
take a ton of
expensive.
time. So, 7 years it takes,
Yeah, it
yes.
takes a long time, and for old people like me, that means I should have started earlier.
That's right.
But no, it's something that we're hoping to be able to demonstrate, and we're in the 4th year
Yes.
of that particular study. So we would like to really come with the information that says you can vaccinate an animal at 12 to 24 weeks of age, and you don't need to necessarily vaccinate it every 3 years the way we do now. And by the way, every one of the states now in the United States has a 3-year rabies law. But you have to know that you may live in a municipality, a city or a county. They can be more restrictive than the state, but they can't be less restrictive. So some of those states, all of which now have 3-year laws, your county or your city may require every 2 years or every 1 year. What I would recommend to every animal owner, and you are the ones that have the ability to change these laws, is get out there and change that county or city or town law to 3 years, because there is absolutely no scientific reason for you to be vaccinating any animal more often than 3 years with products that are licensed by the USDA for 3 years. Revaccinating the same animal more often will not enhance herd immunity or protection against rabies in that environment. And the other thing that's been found is the animal that's not getting vaccinated, whether the requirement is annual or every 3 years, won't get vaccinated. It's just a penalty for the compliant dog owner, and they're actually potentially causing harm to their pet because they're willing to follow the law, whereas the rest of the people who are not vaccinating at all are creating the problem, and they're not going to follow the law, whether it's 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years.
Right.
Now, you also asked me the question, is the 1-year product and the 3-year product really different? Well, most of them are the same. They're the same product. It's just that when the studies were done, they did a 1-year study, and if the product worked, they got a 1-year license. They had a group of dogs that they waited 2 more years for the 3 years to come up, and that same product became a 3-year product.
Except
there may be some that are a bit different. Some actually may have more adjuvant in them if they're a 3-year product, so there are some differences.
And then there's a 1-year rabies vaccine that has no adjuvant.
Correct, and that's used for cats.
Correct, and why was there not a 3-year option? Just because the time, money, research, and funding?
That's a really good question. The cat product is actually new technology. It's a recombinant vaccine. It actually is more like a modified live, but there's no live rabies at all. But the way that the immune system sees it, they see it as being live because it's viral vectored by a virus other than rabies. And the only thing about rabies that's in there is that glycoprotein G that's in the killed vaccine. But the company actually did do studies and demonstrated that their vaccinated group was protected 100% at 3 years. But by USDA law, the non-vaccinated control group must have a certain level of mortality to show that the challenge was effective. And they could not come up to the minimum level with the challenge. So they couldn't get the 3-year license because of that number. So then they decided to actually do it again. Now keep in mind, this is a long-term study, very expensive. They did it again. The vaccinated group, 100% protection again. Even fewer of the non-vaccinated cats died. So at this point, after trying that twice and so forth, I don't know that they would try again. I'm not sure that I would and stay with the 1 year. But that product And as a member of the Vaccine-Associated Sarcoma Task Force, or now they're called Vaccine Injection Site Sarcomas, we were asked the question, would you use this non-adjuvanted vaccine yearly, or would you use a 3-year adjuvanted vaccine? Now, my lab has done a lot of studies, as have other labs done studies on the reaction in that injection site. And it's really the amount of inflammation that, again, in a genetically predisposed cat, that these lethal tumors develop.
And
my response was, I would prefer to give the non-adjuvanted yearly rather than the adjuvanted every 3 years, because there was virtually no inflammation.
Not an inflammatory response.
Right. So even in the genetically predisposed, we would assume that the non-adjuvanted would less likely
reactive.
cause that reaction.
So then, looking toward the future of vaccines pertaining to pets, is the likelihood of us seeing more non-adjuvanted vaccines, which in theory would be safer, less inflammatory, less reactive, is that, talk to me about what's upcoming when it comes to...
Well, that's certainly the goal in the feline species.
And canines too,
yes,
but yeah.
Especially now that we know the feline species is much more likely to develop these injection site sarcomas. Yet you are right, adjuvants in general are more likely to cause adverse reactions in general than non-adjuvanted vaccines. So the answer to your question is yes, there are attempts being made to, one, have fewer adjuvanted vaccines, but two, to come up with new or improved adjuvants that perhaps are not as likely to cause some of these reactions.
Excellent.
Yes.
Excellent.
So yes, there is work in that direction.
That's
yes.
very good. Wonderful.
Yes.
So one last burning question I have. When you mentioned that you've changed your protocol, of course, over the years pertaining to your particular dogs, cats, your grand dogs and your grand cats. If you got a puppy for your own personal enjoyment,
I get those all the time.
How many dogs do you have?
More than you can imagine.
Okay, that's good. We'll leave it at that. So the next puppy in your life, talk to me about what you would do in terms of vaccine protocol for him or her.
Well, I feel very comfortable and confident about the effectiveness of vaccines. I'm also a risk taker. I ride motorcycles, I have a pilot's license, etc. And not everyone feels as comfortable taking risks as I do.
And that would be me.
Yes. So you have to put it in that context to begin with. And a lot of people then, after I tell them that, immediately think, well, I wouldn't do any of those things that he does. But with regard to vaccines, there are not a whole lot of people that know more about veterinary vaccines than I do. So I'm not really taking very much of a risk at all with my pet or my children's or my grandchildren's pets. And so what I would do is I would probably, because I can do antibody titers, I would know when I could effectively immunize that puppy, and I would give the puppy the core vaccines, distemper, parvo, and adeno. At that time, I would check it then 2 or more weeks later to make sure that it has responded, and I would probably not revaccinate the animal again for the rest of its life, which I've been doing since 1974. Would I give a rabies vaccine? Absolutely, and that is considered a core, but I was referring just to the distemper, parvo, adeno part of the core. Now, my protocol for rabies is not dictated by my understanding of immunology, it's dictated by the law. And in that regard, I would give the first dose of rabies sometime after 4 months of age, and in this state, it better be shortly thereafter, otherwise I would be in violation of the state rules. And then I would revaccinate at a year or within a year of that, and then every 3 years. So
there we have it.
that's what I would do, and that's because of the law,
Yes.
not because
Yes.
of that being necessary immunologically.
That's right. There is a big difference between being immunologically able to respond and being compliant with the law. So the law doesn't state that they want your dog immunologically responsive. The law states that you have to give rabies vaccine every 3 years. So if you choose not to do it, you're simply choosing to break the law, which is, of course, people's choice.
But we're not advocating that.
That's right. We're not suggesting that you do anything illegal because we're morally upright, law-abiding citizens.
Correct.
But if you choose to break the law, it is important to recognize that your dog may have lifelong protective immunity after a single rabies vaccine. And if you decide to be a rebel, which we're not advocating, but that if you were a rebel, your dog could still have protection or cat still have protection for the rest of his or her life.
And that's why we're doing this study, to try and get that type of
Yes.
information, to see whether or not we may only have to revaccinate every 7 years
That's right.
instead of every 3 years, which would mean that a dog could really end up only getting 3 to 4 rabies at the
It's a
very
whole life.
most, and that would be going from what used to be annual to 3 to 4 in a lifetime, which would be a real
It would be an improvement.
advantage.
Even more of an improvement would be a 7-year vaccine. In theory, having your pets receive 3
Yeah, that's right.
potentially.
Correct.
So research is underway.
Right.
And it's all because of you. Really, truly, Dr. Schultz, you are single-handedly changing the face of immunologic veterinary medicine. And we are all so grateful for all the work you do, for your effort and your passion towards what you do, and for helping all of us be able to make better decisions for the animals in our care. We're wholeheartedly thankful for everything that you do.
Well, thank you for that. And I'd also like to thank the veterinarians who have made a change in their vaccination program. And I'd also like to thank the companies, because one of the things that I knew I had to do is get every one of the companies to actually do studies with their products, even though I had done studies with their products unbeknownst to them very often. Every one of the major veterinary manufacturers of vaccines has done a 3-year minimum duration of immunity study with their core vaccines, and they have all demonstrated that their products provide a minimum of 3 years duration of immunity. And that should say something to every veterinarian that's out there and that's wondering, oh, can I really go 3 years? And every dog owner that's out there. And the answer is yes.
Yes, confidently.
Confidently, you can go 3 years, regardless of the product used.
Excellent.
Good.
Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for
Thanks.
giving me this opportunity.